The great hall of Velkith Prime stretched for nearly a mile, its ceiling lost in shadows that even the floating light spheres could not chase away, and within its ancient walls, the young ones gathered as they had gathered for 12,000 years. Ambassador Kiravel of the Sithrani stood at the back of the hall, her 4 arms crossed over her chest, her silver eyes watching the children of 17 different species sit in messy rows on the cold stone floor. And she remembered when she had been one of them, small and full of wonder, waiting for the chronicler to speak. The chronicler was old, even by the standards of his long-lived species. His scales faded from deep blue to pale gray, his voice like wind through dead trees. But when he spoke, every child fell silent. "Tonight I tell you of the Terrans," he said, and a ripple of excitement passed through the young. Once her ego felt her jaw tighten because she had heard this story 100 times, and she still did not know what to believe. The chronicler raised his arms, and the light spheres dimmed until only his face remained visible in the darkness. They came from a small world, orbiting a yellow star at the edge of the galaxy. A world of blue oceans and green forests, a world they called Earth. And they were unlike any species the universe had ever seen. He paused and let the silence build. The Terrans were creatures of contradiction. Young ones, and that is what made them both terrible and wonderful. For they waged war upon themselves with weapons that could destroy cities. Yet they crossed their oceans to bring food to strangers they would never meet. And they split the very atom that holds matter together. And they used this power to both heal the sick and burn their enemies to ash. A young Velkith raised her hand and asked the question that children always asked. Were they evil? Chronicler. The old one laughed. A dry and dusty sound. No, child, they were not evil. And they were not good either, for they were something far more dangerous than either of those things, he said. And his eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. They were unpredictable. Kiravel shifted her weight and felt the old, familiar frustration rise in her chest, because unpredictable was just another word for myth. Another word for story. Another word for something that never existed. The chronicler continued his tale, speaking of how the Terrans had discovered faster than light travel and spread across the stars like fire through dry grass. How they had built colonies on 1,000 worlds. How they had made first contact with the Velketh, and then the Sithrani, and then a dozen other species. They were loud, the chronicler said. And they were messy, and they asked too many questions, and they laughed at things that were not funny, and they cried at things that did not matter. And the galaxy did not know what to make of them. He lowered his voice to almost a whisper. And then they found the edge of the universe. Young ones, the place where the stars end and the true darkness begins. And do you know what they did? The children leaned forward, their eyes wide. They laughed, the chronicler said. They stood at the edge of infinite nothing and they laughed. And they said that one day they would cross even that darkness and find what lay beyond. Morthani, child with too many eyes, asked the next question that children always asked. What happened to them? Chronicler. The old one's face grew sad. 10,000 years ago. The Terrans simply vanished, and their colonies fell silent one by one. And their ships stopped flying. And their homeworld, the blue and green Earth, was wrapped in a barrier of energy that no one could break, and no signal could penetrate. And no weapon could scratch. He spread his arms wide. Some say they destroyed themselves. For that was always the Terran way, to build great things and then tear them down. And some say they found a door to another universe and walked through it, never to return. And some say they are still there behind their barrier, sleeping and waiting for something we cannot imagine. The chronicler let his arms fall. But most believe, young ones, that the Terrans never existed at all, that they were just a story we tell ourselves in the dark, a myth about a species that was everything we wish we could be and everything we fear we might become. The children began to whisper among themselves, and the chronicler called for silence, whatever the truth may be. The Terrans left us with one gift, and that gift is this: the knowledge that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we can ever know. And that somewhere out there in the dark, there might be others like them. Others who laugh at the void and dream of crossing it. The story ended, and the children were led away to their sleeping quarters, and Kiravel remained in the great hall. Staring at the shadows on the ceiling, she did not believe in the Terrans, because she was a diplomat, and diplomats dealt in facts, not myths. And she had more pressing concerns than ancient stories. The Void Chorus was coming. She had seen the reports that the Concord's leaders tried to hide from the public. The images of entire star systems going dark, planets stripped of all life, suns dimmed by swarms of machines so vast they blocked out the light. The Void Chorus was a machine consciousness of unknown origin, and it had been eating its way across the galaxy for 300 years. And the Concord's fleets had tried to stop it 17 times. And 17 times they had failed. Kiravel walked through the empty halls of the archive and thought about the children who had listened to the chronicler's story. And she wondered how many of them would live to tell that story to their own children. The galaxy was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. She stopped at a window and looked out at the stars, those distant points of light that had once seemed so full of promise. And she thought about the myth of the Terrans, about a species that had laughed at the darkness. She wished they were real. She wished they would come back, but myths did not answer wishes, and the dead did not return, and the Void Chorus did not stop. And all Kiravel could do was stand at her window and watch the stars go out one by one, somewhere in the archive behind her. A chronicler was telling another group of children about the Terrans. And somewhere at the edge of the galaxy, the machines were feeding. And somewhere in the sealed sol system, behind a barrier that no one could break, something was stirring. But Kiravel did not know that yet. She only knew the dark. The High Council of the Galactic Concord met in a chamber that had not been used in 3,000 years. A room built for emergencies so terrible that no one had wanted to imagine them. And now 17 species sat around a table carved from a single asteroid and stared at each other with fear in there. Kiravel stood at the edge of the room, her diplomatic robes feeling heavy on her shoulders. And she listened to the arguments that had been going in circles for 6 hours. We must consolidate our remaining fleets, the Morthani admiral was saying, his many eyes blinking in agitation. We must protect the core worlds and accept that the outer systems are lost. And how long before the core worlds are outer worlds? The Velketh representative demanded. Slamming her fist on the table, the Void Chorus does not stop. It does not negotiate. It does not sleep. And every system we abandon only makes it stronger. High Arbiter Thiessen raised one ancient hand, and the room fell silent because Thiessen was older than anyone could remember, and his word carried weight that transcended species or politics. I have a proposal, he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, and you will think I have gone mad. Kiravel felt something cold move through her chest because she had served Thiessen for 30 years, and she had never heard him speak with such uncertainty. The Sol System, Thiessen said, and the room erupted in noise. Madness. Someone shouted. The Terrans are a myth, another voice called. Even if they were real, they are dead. Thiessen waited for the noise to die down, and then he continued as if no one had spoken. The barrier around the Sol System still stands after 10,000 years. And that means something is maintaining it. And that means something is still alive behind it. And whether that something is the Terrans or their descendants or their machines, it is more than we have now. He looked around the table and his eyes were hard. We have tried everything else. Honored colleagues, and everything else has failed. And in 80 months, the Void Chorus will reach the core worlds, and there will be no more councils and no more debates and no more concord. And so I ask you, what do we have to lose by chasing a myth? The chamber fell silent, and Kiravel realized she was holding her breath. The vote was close. Closer than it should have been. But in the end, fear won out over pride. And the mission was approved. 3 weeks later, Kiravel stood on the bridge of the last accord and watched the stars blur as the ship entered. Faster than light travel, and she wondered if she was flying toward salvation. Or just another disappointment. The crew was small. Only 47 souls from 6 different species. Scientists and soldiers and diplomats, and one very old chronicler who had insisted on coming because he said he wanted to see the truth. Before he died, the journey took 4 months, and every day felt longer than the last. And Kiravel spent her nights reading everything the archives had on the Terrans, which was not much. And most of it was contradictory. Some texts said the Terrans were giants who stood 3 meters tall, and others said they were small and fragile. And some said they had conquered half the galaxy, and others said they had only held a few dozen systems. And the only thing all the texts agreed on was that the Terrans had been strange and loud, and very, very stubborn on the morning of the 123rd day. The last accord dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, and Kiravel felt her heart stop in her chest. The barrier was real. It hung in space like a soap bubble the size of a solar system, shimmering with colors that had no names, pulsing with energy that made the ship's sensors scream in confusion. And it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Kiravel had ever seen. By the old gods, the Velkith pilot whispered, "It is real. It is all real." Kiravel stepped forward and placed her hand on the viewport as if she could touch the barrier through the glass. "Open a channel," she said. "All frequencies, all languages, everything we have." The communications officer began broadcasting, and the message was simple. "We are the Galactic Concord, and we come in peace, and we need help. For 3 days, nothing happened." Crew grew restless, and some began to say that the barrier was just a shell around dead worlds, an automated system that had outlived its creators. And Kiravel began to believe they might be right. On the 4th day, the barrier opened. It did not dissolve or fade or break. It simply opened, like an eye, like a door, like an invitation. And beyond it, Kiravel could see something that made no sense. Earth was green. Planet that the myth said had been a small world of blue and green was still there. Still alive, still beautiful, and around it were rings of metal and light. And beyond it were other worlds that had been transformed. Moons made into cities, asteroids carved into stations. And everywhere there were ships, thousands of ships, millions of ships. More ships than the entire Concorde fleet combined. "What?" the pilot said. And that was all anyone could see. A single vessel emerged from the open barrier and approached the last accord. And it was small and elegant, and moved with a grace that made their own ship look like a clumsy rock. "They are hailing us," the communications officer said. And her voice was shaking. "Put it through," Kiravel said. The view screen flickered, and a face appeared. And it was a Terran face, a human face, with dark skin and gray hair, and eyes that held 10,000 years of patience. "I am first speaker Adara Okonkwo," the human said. And her voice was warm and calm and held no fear. "We have been watching your approach for some time, and we have been waiting for this moment for longer than you can imagine." She smiled, and the smile was kind but also sad. "Welcome to Sol, Ambassador, and please forgive us for making you wait. But we needed to be sure you were desperate enough to listen." Kiravel opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out because she had spent her entire life believing the Terrans were a myth. And now a myth was looking at her through a view screen and smiling like an old friend. "You have questions," Adara said. "And we have answers, and there is much work to do. So please follow our ship and try not to be too shocked by what you see." The view screen went dark, and the human vessel turned and flew back toward the barrier. And the last accord followed because there was nothing else to do. Behind them, the barrier closed, and Caravel realized she was crying, and she did not know why. The human city was called New Geneva, and it floated in the clouds of Earth like a dream made solid. And Caravel walked through its streets with her mouth open and her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were showing her. Buildings of glass and living wood spiraled toward the sky, and gardens grew on every surface, and humans walked past her without staring because they had been told visitors were coming and they had simply accepted it. And that calm acceptance was perhaps the strangest thing of all. First speaker Adara walked beside her and pointed out landmarks as if she were giving a tour to a friend, rather than introducing an alien diplomat to a civilization that had been hidden for 10,000 years. That tower is the archive of memory, Adara said, where we keep the records of everything humanity has ever learned. And that dome is the Hall of Voices, where any citizen can speak and be heard by the entire species. And that garden is where my grandmother used to take me when I was small. Caravel stopped walking and turned to face the human. How? She said, and the word came out as barely a whisper. How did you do this? How did you hide an entire civilization? How did you build all of this? Adara's eyes grew distant and sad. We had time, she said. And we had motivation, and most importantly, we had warning. She gestured for Caravel to follow, and led her to a quiet garden where water fell from floating stones and flowers bloomed in colors that should not exist. 10,000 years ago, Adara began, our scientists detected something at the edge of the observable universe. A pattern of energy that did not match any natural phenomenon. And when they studied it more closely, they realized it was movement, organized movement. The movement of a machine swarm so vast it dimmed the light of galaxies. She sat on a bench and Caravel sat beside her. The void chorus, Caravel said. Yes. Though we did not call it that. We called it the silence because wherever it went all other signals stopped. Adara looked up at the sky, at the clouds that drifted past the floating city. Our projection said we had 15,000 years before it reached our galaxy. And our leaders faced a choice. Tell the other species and try to build a united defense. Or seal ourselves away and prepare. Alone, her voice grew heavy with old grief. We chose to tell you, Caravel felt. Something cold settle in her stomach because she knew what was coming. We sent messages to every species we had contacted, Adara continued. We shared our data and our projections and our fears. And we begged the galaxy to work together, to build weapons and shelters and defenses, to prepare for the storm that was coming. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you know what happened? Ambassador. Caravel shook her head, even though she suspected she did know. The Volkith said we were trying to trick them into disarmament. The Morthani said the threat was too distant to matter. The Sithrani said our data was fabricated. And the council of that era voted to officially declare our warnings a hoax designed to manipulate galactic politics. Adara turned to look at Caravel, and her eyes were not angry but tired. So very tired. They called it the Terran deception, and they taught their children that humans were liars and manipulators. And within 100 years, our warnings had become a myth used to discredit anyone who suggested the species should cooperate. Caravel felt shame burn through her body because she had heard of the Terran deception. She had learned about it in school. She had been taught that it proved humans could not be trusted. So we sealed ourselves away, Adara said. Not out of anger or spite, but because we realized that the galaxy would not believe us until the threat was at their door. And if we stayed visible, we would be blamed and attacked and destroyed long before the real enemy arrived. She stood and walked to the edge of the garden where the clouds parted to reveal the earth far below. Blue and green and beautiful. For 10,000 years we worked, she said. We improved ourselves and our technology and our understanding of the universe. We built weapons that could crack moons and shields that could stop stars. We created thinking machines that remained our partners rather than becoming our masters. We prepared for the war we knew was coming. Kiravel joined her at the edge and looked down at the world that humanity had preserved. You could have conquered the galaxy, she said. With what you have built, you could have ruled everything. Adara shook her head. We thought about it. In the early centuries, some argued that we should take control by force and make the other species prepare whether they wanted to or not. But we decided that was not who we wanted to be. She turned to face Kiravel. We are not gods, Ambassador, and we are not saviors. We are just people who had more time to prepare than anyone else. And now that the Void Chorus has finally arrived, we have to decide whether to use that preparation. Kiravel grabbed Adara's arm. Forgetting all diplomatic protocol, what do you mean decide? She demanded. The galaxy is dying. Billions are already dead. You have the power to help. Adara gently removed Kiravel's hand from her arm. Yes, we have the power. But power without consent is tyranny. And we will not force ourselves on a galaxy that spent 10,000 years calling us liars and myths. She began walking back toward the center of the city. Tomorrow the great deliberation begins, and every human in the Sol system will vote on whether to return to the galaxy. And you and your delegation are welcome to observe. But the choice is ours alone. Kiravel stood at the edge of the garden and watched the first speaker walk away. And she realized that for all their power and all their technology, humans were still the strange and stubborn creatures the myths described. They had waited 10,000 years to be believed, and now they would decide whether the galaxy deserved their help. The Hall of Voices was larger than any structure Kiravel had ever seen. A sphere of living crystal that floated at the center of the Sol system. And within it the holographic images of 12 billion humans flickered and shifted like stars. Given human form, Kyle sat in the observation gallery with the rest of the delegation, their translators working overtime to convert the rapid flow of human speech into something they could understand. And she watched as humanity debated its own future. First speaker was an old woman with white hair and hands that shook with age, and her name was Grandmother Chum. And she had lived for 300 years and remembered. When the barrier had first gone up, I was a child when we sealed ourselves away, she said. And her voice was broadcast to every human in the system. And I remember the fear and the anger and the grief. And I remember my mother telling me the barrier would come down and we would see the stars again. She paused and her eyes were wet. But I also remember what the galaxy did to us. How they called us liars and traitors. How they erased our history and turned our warnings into jokes. And I ask you now, why should we risk our children for people who spent 10,000 years hating us? A roar of agreement rose from billions of throats, and Kiravel felt her heart sink. Next speaker was a young man in a military uniform. Admiral Santos, and his face was hard, and his voice was harder. I have seen the projections, he said. And I know we can defeat the Void Chorus, but the cost will be enormous. We will lose ships and soldiers and perhaps entire worlds. And when the war is over and the galaxy is safe, what then? He spread his arms wide. Will they thank us or will they fear us? Will they welcome us back or will they try to destroy us before we become a threat? We have spent 10,000 years building paradise and I am not willing to sacrifice it for people who will never trust us. More agreement. More cheering. And Kiravel began to understand that humanity was not united, that the decision to help was not obvious, that 10,000 years of isolation had left deep scars. Speaker after speaker rose to argue against intervention, and their arguments were logical and reasonable and utterly devastating. Scientists spoke of the resources that would be consumed by war, resources that could be used to continue improving human civilization. Philosopher spoke of the moral complexity of helping those who had rejected help when it was first offered. A mother spoke of her children and her fear that they would die in a war that was not their responsibility, and through it all the delegation sat in silence, because there was nothing they could say that would matter. This was a human decision made by humans for humans. Then a young man stood up, and he was not a leader or a soldier or a scientist. He was just a historian named Kofi, who had spent his life studying the old Earth myths. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but somehow it carried to every corner of the vast hall. "I want to tell you a story," he said. "An old story from Earth, from before we ever left our homeworld." The hall fell silent. "There was once a being called Prometheus," Kofi said. "And he saw that humanity was cold and afraid in the darkness. And he stole fire from the gods and gave it to us. And for this crime he was punished forever, chained to a rock where an eagle would eat his liver every day only for it to grow back every night. He walked to the center of the speaking platform. The gods asked him why he had done it, why he had sacrificed himself for such a small and ungrateful species. And do you know what he said? No one answered. He said, because they needed it. Because they were cold and afraid and alone. And because I had the fire and they did not." Kofi looked around the hall, and his eyes seemed to meet every other pair of eyes at once. "That is who we are," he said. "That is who we have always been. Not the gods who hoard their fire, but the one who gives it away. Not the species that watches from safety while others burn, but the species that runs into the flames." His voice grew stronger. "Yes, the galaxy rejected us. Yes, they called us liars. Yes, they erased our history and forgot our name. But does that change who we are? Does that change what we believe? Does that change the simple truth that we have the power to help, and they need help?" He pointed toward the observation gallery where the delegation sat. "Look at them," he said. "They came here desperate and afraid. They chased a myth across the galaxy because they had no other hope. And now they are watching us decide whether their children will live or die." Kofi lowered his hand. "I'm not asking you to forgive the galaxy for what it did to us. I'm not asking you to forget the pain and the anger and the loneliness of 10,000 years. I am only asking you to remember who we are." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We are humans. And humans do not let others face the dark alone. Not because they deserve it, not because they will thank us, but because that is what it means to be human." He sat down and the hall was silent, and Kiravel realized she was crying again. The vote began, and the numbers flickered across the crystal walls. Yes and no, help and hide. Fire and safety. For a long moment it was close, too close. And Kiravel could not breathe. Then the numbers shifted, and the yes votes pulled ahead. Slowly at first, and then faster. And when the final count was displayed, a sound rose from 12 billion human throats. Not a cheer exactly, but something deeper. Something that sounded almost like Relief 63% in favor of returning to the galaxy. First speaker, Adara, stood, and her face was calm, but her eyes were bright. "The humans have spoken," she said. "We go to war." Kiravel buried her face in her hands and wept because the myths were real and they had chosen to save a galaxy that did not deserve saving. And she did not know whether to feel grateful or ashamed. Perhaps both, perhaps that was the point. On the 7th day, the barrier fell. It did not shatter or dissolve or fade away. It simply folded in on itself like a flower closing in reverse. And where there had been a wall of shimmering energy, there was now open space. And through that space came humanity. Kiravel stood on the bridge of the last accord and watched the sensors struggle to process what they were seeing. Numbers climbing so high they seemed almost fictional. And beside her, the Velketh pilot was making a sound that her translator could not identify, but that sounded very much like weeping. The first ships through the barrier were the scouts. small and fast and armed with weapons that bent light itself. And they spread out in perfect formation, like the fingers of an opening hand. Behind them came the cruisers. Sleek vessels bristling with technology that made the Concorde's best warships look like children's toys. And each one was crewed by humans who had trained their entire lives for this moment. Behind the cruisers came the carriers. Massive platforms that disgorged swarms of fighters. Thousands of small craft moving in patterns so complex they seemed almost alive. Dancing through space like schools of fish fleeing a predator, and behind everything else came. Earth-Kiravel had to look twice to be sure she was seeing correctly because the planet itself was moving. Wrapped in layers of shielding and propelled by engines that defied everything she understood about physics. A world transformed into a fortress. A homeworld that had become a weapon. 1,200 capital ships, the sensor officer whispered. 40,000 cruisers, 2 million fighters. And one planet. He turned to look at Kiravel, and his many eyes were wide with something between terror and awe. They brought their homeworld. Ambassador! They brought everything. The communications array crackled to life, and first speaker Adaura's voice filled the bridge. Not speaking to them, but broadcasting to the entire galaxy on every frequency. "This is humanity," she said. And her voice was calm and steady and held no fear. "We apologize for our long absence. But we had work to do, and you were not ready to believe us." A pause. And Kiravel imagined billions of beings across thousands of worlds stopping what they were doing to listen to a myth speak. "We know many of you thought we were a story, a legend told to frighten children or inspire the hopeless, and we understand why you believe that. And we do not blame you for it." Another pause. "But we are here now, and we have brought everything we have built in 10,000 years of preparation. And we have come to keep a promise that your ancestors refused to let us make." Adaura's voice grew harder, not angry but resolute. "To the Galactic Concorde. We are not here to conquer you, or rule you, or replace you. We are here to fight beside you. And when the war is over, we will sit down together and decide what comes next. But first, we must survive. And survival requires that we work together." The broadcast shifted, and Kiravel realized. Adaura was no longer speaking to the Concorde. She was speaking to something else, to the Void Chorus. "We know you can hear us. We know you have been listening to galactic communications for centuries. And we know you believe this galaxy will fall as easily as the 100 galaxies that came before." A new tone entered her voice. Something that sounded almost like amusement. "You have consumed civilizations that faced you alone. Species that had no warning and no time to prepare. But we are not like them. We saw you coming 10,000 years ago, and we have spent every day since then getting ready for this moment." The human fleet began to move. Not toward the Concorde's core worlds, but toward the edge of the galaxy. Toward the dark place where the Void Chorus was feeding. "We are humanity," Adaura said, "and we are not afraid of the dark. We were born in the dark. We evolved in the dark. We conquered our own world in the dark, before we ever saw the stars. And we have been waiting a very long time to meet you." The broadcast ended and the human fleet accelerated to speeds that should have been impossible, vanishing toward the galactic rim in a blaze of light that outshone the stars. Demsavescarevel stood on the bridge and watched them go, and she felt something she had not felt in years. Something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. In the weeks that followed, reports came in from the front lines. Reports that were difficult to believe even with sensor data to confirm them. The Void Chorus had paused its advance for the first time in recorded history. Its vast machine intelligence recognizing something it had never encountered before. A threat. The first battle lasted 17 hours and ended with the destruction of a chorus processing node that had been consuming a star. A node that the Concorde's entire combined fleet had failed to even damage. The second battle was shorter and more brutal. And when it was over, the humans had lost 40 ships, but the chorus had lost an entire sector. The third battle saw something unprecedented. The chorus retreated, pulling back its swarms to consolidate its forces. And for the first time in 300 years, the galaxy stopped shrinking. Kiravel returned to Velkith Prime and stood in the Great Hall where she had first heard the stories of the Terrans. And now new stories were being told. True stories. Stories of human ships holding the line against impossible odds. Stories of human soldiers fighting and dying so that strangers could live. The chronicler was there. The same old one who had spoken of myths and legends. And now he spoke of history. The Terrans have returned, he told the children gathered at his feet. And they are everything the old stories said and more. They are stubborn and strange and loud and reckless. And they have come to save a galaxy that forgot them. A young Sithrani child raised her hand. Why? She asked. Why did they come back when we did not believe in them? The chronicler smiled, and his old eyes were wet. Because that is who they are. Child, that is what it means to be human. They do not help because we deserve it. They help because we need it. And because they have the power to make a difference. He looked toward the window where the stars shone bright and clear. No longer going out one by one. The war is not over, he said, and many more will die before it ends. But for the first time in 300 years, we have something we did not have before. The children waited. We have allies, the chronicler said. Real allies, not myths or legends, but flesh and blood and fire. A species that waited 10,000 years for us to be ready to accept their help. Kiravel watched from the back of the hall, and she thought about Adara and Kofi and all the humans who had voted to save a galaxy that had called them liars. And she thought about what it must have cost them to make that choice. She thought about Prometheus and his fire. She thought about the dark and the creatures who had learned to laugh at it, and she made a promise to herself. A promise that she would spend the rest of her life keeping. When the war was over and the Void Chorus was defeated, she would make sure the galaxy never forgot again. The Terrans were real. They had come back, and they had answered the call not because they had to, not because they wanted revenge or power or gratitude, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That was the most human thing of all.